Unless you count lunch and recess, I was one of those kids that as I grew up, I was not interested in school whatsoever. In fact, I have a funny story about how I managed to graduate from school. In high school, I had friends that would do homework for me, math, Spanish, history. I literally had help with all of it. I was one of those kids that would say, math is stupid, and how does that apply in the real world? Well, it was my second senior year, and it was my second senior year because I had skipped so much school the first year that I had to redo my senior year. And so that second year, I took exactly the amount of credits that I needed to graduate. And so long as I actually passed all my classes, I would graduate. Well, I had a mythology class that we had to do a collage to pass the class, and if you didn't do this collage, you would not pass the class, and therefore I wouldn't graduate. And the semester continued on, and as normal, I had ignored my teachers, and the very last day of school came, and our teacher said, all right, everybody, turn in your collage, because you can't pass without this. And I started to panic, and at that point, my best friend Larry walks up to me and said, do I know you better than anybody? And I said, yes, why? And he goes, because I knew you wouldn't do your homework, and I knew you wouldn't do your collage, so I did too. And he gave me a collage, and that allowed me to get past my mythology class and graduate. And the kicker is that I got an A- on the one that he did for me, and he got a B+ on the one that he did for himself. And it's actually a true story. So that shows where I was mentally at that grade. Here I am in high school. Mostly all I cared about was chasing girls, having very bad haircuts, and very cheap tans. So after graduation, life pretty much continued the same. All we did was party, goof off, chase girls. This gives a good example of what life was like for us at the time. And school and math and learning was the absolute furthest thing from my mind. Truly, all we did was go to bars and goof off. But then in 2002, life took a radically different course for me. I had a friend at a karaoke bar that called me, and she needed a ride home, as she had had too much to drink, and her date were there. And so I went to give them a ride, and I wound up singing a song, and I had a Coke, paid for it, and left. Well, unbeknownst to us, there was these two criminals there that knew the waitresses, and the waitresses would tip off the bad guys as to who had cash, and you would get attacked and robbed when you left. Well, from my perspective, I didn't see anything. I left the bar, and as I was walking out, these two men came up behind me and smashed me in the back of the head at a full run. I didn't see them coming. I just saw a little puff of light, like you hear boxers talk about when they get knocked out. And the next thing I knew is I was on the ground just getting beat, kicked in the face, kicked in the back, from all different directions. And I got this feeling of, I'm going to die right now, this is it. And that weird fight or flight instinct came on, and since there was no chance for me to flee, my fight instinct came on, and I managed to grab one of the guys, and I bit him on the inside of his leg. But unfortunately, he was wearing those big baggy pants, and all I got was fabric, and I cracked my front teeth. And so I tried to bite him again, and at that point, the other person that was attacking me just kept kicking me in the head repeatedly, and after about a minute of this, finally they said, give me your goddamn jacket. So I threw my jacket off, and they grabbed it, and they ran away. Well, I was taken to the hospital and given a very powerful pain shot, and was diagnosed with a concussion, a bleeding kidney, and a spinal injury. And I was sent home. And I remember as I was going home, I was thinking how strange everything looked. And I thought, this pain medicine is some pretty wild stuff because everything looked so weird. Well, the next day when I woke up, it was obvious that it was not the pain medicine that was causing everything to look different. Whenever something moved, instead of looking smooth like it used to, it looked like individual, discrete picture frames instead of being smooth. And I was absolutely amazed when I realized that this must be how our brain constructs a moving image, much like a video camera, where we're seeing individual pictures. And then there's a portion of our brain that smooths out those pictures for us. But for me, that smoothness was now gone. And I remember looking at my hand, and it was like looking at my hand for the very first time. Instead of being smooth, all the edges looked like they had these little discrete straight lines. Perhaps from a distance, this looks, somewhat smooth, but when you zoom in, you see that it's really not. There's little edges on everything. And I was absolutely amazed. It was like looking at my hand for the first time, and I would move my hand back and forth, and the faster I moved it, the further apart the picture frames were, and the slower I would move it, the closer the picture frames were. And it was absolutely beautiful. I found that bright lights seemed like somehow amplified, and the little jagged patterns that these picture frames made were absolutely beautiful and somehow seemed to be related to like a lattice or a grid structure, similar to what we see in math. So I started trying to draw what I saw, and I did this drawing just to try to show how, like, imagine we see a balloon moving, and we see it moving smoothly, but I see it more like this. And the best way I can think of describing it is imagine if you're watching television, you know how you can hit pause on your TV, and if you keep hitting pause, you see frame by frame by frame. That's how I see now, but in real time. So I started drawing what I was seeing, and I found it to be mathematical, but I had no math skills at the time whatsoever. In fact, at that point, I didn't even know how to graph a linear equation, a straight line. And so I started making these drawings, like of the number pi. There's a way to draw it. And when you think about the number pi in a traditional math term, you would be talking about something like this, a big squeeze theorem, with f of the x equals x times the sine of pi divided by x, etc. But what I saw when I visualized pi was this: a shape like a circle that was subdivided into triangles, and the more that we subdivided that, the closer we approached to a circle, and we would approach closer and closer forever, but never actually get there. Imagine like if you're watching a television screen and you see a circle on TV. That circle on TV is actually made with triangles because it's made with pixels. And this is much the same way. So as you draw more and more triangles, this circle itself becomes smoother. This has 360 sides, and then the finest I could draw it was like this, which is 720 sides. And as you can see, we are approaching closer and closer to a circle, but you never actually get there. And what was so amazing about this was that technically, perfect circles don't exist because you can continually segment this circle forever and approach a circle, but never actually get there. This is a zoom in. I wanted to show everybody, like, if you look here, these little empty gaps, that is not area of the circle. But when I draw it with twice as many triangles, you can see how some of that empty space is filled in. And then when we draw it with more, it gets smoother and smoother and smoother. And so this is what I thought of as math. And so I started taking my drawings and submitting them to colleges, thinking I would get these answers back saying, oh, this is pi, and let us tell you about it. And I got responses back like, what the heck is this? Where's the equation? And so one day, there were some negative things that had come along with this. After I had this brain injury, I also developed OCD and agoraphobia. Agoraphobia is like, ironically, the fear of being in front of a lot of people. So it's very difficult for me to get up in front of an audience. But so I wound up holing up in my house basically for 3.5 years, and I didn't leave my house unless I absolutely had to. And then one day I ran out of food, and I absolutely had to leave the house, and I went to the mall and I had a sandwich, and I wound up meeting a physicist, and we started talking, and I started showing him my drawings, and he said, you know, what you're drawing looks very mathematical, but you have no traditional mathematical skills. Maybe you should come back to college and learn math. And that is what I did. I went back to college, and that was the best advice I ever got from anybody, because I was able to then write it in traditional form, but also draw it. And what was so amazing is that the equations and the drawings are really the same thing. So for instance, like when I talked to him, when he would talk about square roots, he would say 8 to the third power. But like, for instance, 8 to the third power, this is what I see. And you can think of it as like each little cube being the number 1, and here's 8 cubes, so that's the number 8, and then we square that 8 into 64, and then 8 cubed is that 64 stacked 8 high. So 8 cubed and this drawing are actually one and the same thing. And for instance, fusion, when he started talking about fusion, he would talk about things like this, which at the time I had no understanding of, but what I saw was this: a geometric timed implosion that would get atoms close enough together to fuse. Or for instance, when he would talk about the Doppler effect and relativity, this is what I would see. This is one of my favorites, and because it only takes a couple minutes to explain just the idea of relativity. You know how we've all heard a car drive by us, and when the car drives by, it goes and it changes pitch? That's because as the car's coming towards you, the sound waves are leaving it, and the sound waves get squished together, and shorter waves you hear as a high pitch. And then it goes by you, and the waves stretch out and get longer, and then you hear the pitch go and get lower. But if you add relativity to it and say, I am here, and somebody else is here, and we have a car driving between us, well, relative to me, the car's moving away from me, so I hear a low pitch. But at the same time, the person over here, the car's moving towards them, and they hear a high pitch. And what you do right there is you stop and say, what sound is the car making? The low pitch or the high pitch? And it's making both relative to who's looking at it. And then you take it one step further and say, now imagine we have 1 million people all looking at that car, and each person is moving at a different speed. Every one of them hears a different sound. And then the very final question they ask is, which reality is the real one? They're all real, they're just relative. So that car is making a wave that is interpreted as sound based on the position and velocity of the observer and the observed. So you can many times explain things that are extremely difficult with a drawing, whereas if you wanted to explain it in equation, you'd have to have 4 years of school to be doing a good job of it. Here's just some more drawings that I made. Every one of these is an equation, but you can see how beautiful equations are when they're drawn out. A lot of us see just digits and numbers, and they don't mean much, but when you see what they look like, they're absolutely stunning. Here we have a drawing of a fractal that I drew in an actual interference pattern. Later on, I found out that these fractals that I was drawing were actually real things in the real world, which made me feel good knowing that it was something that was real and not a figment of my imagination. Well, when I went back to school, the most wonderful thing happened, because when this mugging occurred, it seemed like it was the worst thing that could ever have happened in my life, and I was depressed about it. But when I went back to school, I met my wife, and not only did I learn math, but we wound up getting married. And we just had a baby recently, and we have another baby on the way. So it's funny how when you look at something and you see how bad it is, and you think, this is the worst thing that's ever happened to me, but then 10 years later, because of this drawing and because of this violent criminal act, I have met my life partner who I love beyond anything, and this is our little baby girl, and we have another little baby on the way. So sometimes things that seem really bad aren't quite as bad as they seem. So thank you very much.
Wow.